military recruits is ignorant about the damage that can come from bad behavior online. That news conference on C-SPAN 2 shortly. Now live to the House.
The question on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 429 and adoption of the resolution if ordered. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. The remaining electronic vote will be conducted as a 5-minute vote. The unfinished business is the vote on ordering the previous question on House Resolution 429, on which the ayes and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 77, House Resolution 429, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3309 to amend Title 35 United States Code and the Leahy-Smith American Advance Act to make improvements and technical corrections and for other purposes, and providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1105 to amend the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 to provide registration exemption for private equity fund advisors and for other purposes.
The question is on ordering the previous question. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
2 votes in this series. Earlier today, they debated the rule for 2 bills, a combined rule. One of the bills would modify the patent infringement litigation process to discourage the abuse of the system. The other bill, that if the rule passes today, will get consideration this afternoon. That bill would exempt most private equity firms from registering with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is the previous question vote. Democrats are seeking to bring forth considering a resolution providing for not allowing for adjournment unless the House has adopted a conference report on the budget resolution. That budget resolution is due 9 days from today on December the 13th. As the session was getting underway this afternoon, Speaker Boehner described some of the legislative record of the House, saying that the House has passed nearly 150 bills aimed at boosting job creation, all of which have been blocked by Senate Democrats. At about the same time, President Obama was wrapping up his comments at the Center for American Progress, saying that the income gap between America's rich and poor is, quote, a defining challenge of our time. He said the income inequality has jeopardized the nation's middle class, and he urged Washington to take steps to ensure that the economy works for everyone. That reporting from the Associated Press. We're going to show you some of the President's comments during this first vote. It's 15 minutes, and we'll show you as much as we can of the President's comments this afternoon.
But let me offer a few key principles, just a roadmap that I believe should guide us in both our legislative agenda and our administrative efforts. To begin with, we have to continue to relentlessly push a growth agenda. It may be true that in today's economy, growth alone does not guarantee higher wages and incomes. We've seen that. But what's also true is we can't tackle inequality if the economic pie is shrinking or stagnant. The fact is, if you're a progressive and you want to help the middle class and the working poor, you've still got to be concerned about competitiveness and productivity and business confidence that spurs private sector investment. And that's why from day one we've worked to get the economy growing and help our businesses hire. And thanks to their resilience and innovation, they've created nearly 8 million new jobs over the past 44 months. And now we've got to grow the economy even faster. And we've got to keep working to make America a magnet for good middle-class jobs to replace the ones that we've lost in recent decades. Jobs in manufacturing and energy and infrastructure and technology. And that means simplifying our corporate tax code in a way that closes wasteful loopholes and ends incentives to ship jobs overseas. By broadening the base, we can actually lower rates to encourage more companies to hire here and use some of the money we save to create good jobs rebuilding our roads and our bridges and our airports and all the infrastructure our businesses need. It means a trade agenda that grows exports and works for the middle class. It means streamlining regulations that are outdated or unnecessary or too costly. And it means coming together around a responsible budget, one that grows our economy faster right now and shrinks our long-term deficits, one that unwinds the harmful sequester cuts that haven't made a lot of sense, and then frees up resources to invest in things like the scientific research that's always unleashed new innovation and new industries. When it comes to our budget, we should not be stuck in a stale debate from 2 years ago or 3 years ago. A relentlessly growing deficit of opportunity is a bigger threat to our future than our rapidly shrinking fiscal deficit. So that's step one towards restoring mobility, making sure our economy is growing faster. Step two is making sure we empower more Americans with the skills and education they need to compete in a highly competitive global economy. We know that education is the most important predictor of income today. So we launched a race to the top in our schools. We're supporting states that have raised standards for teaching and learning. We're pushing for redesigned high schools that graduate more kids with the technical training and apprenticeships and in-demand high-tech skills that can lead directly to a good job and a middle-class life. We know it's harder to find a job today without some higher education, so we've helped more students go to college with grants and loans that go farther than before. We've made it more practical to repay those loans, and today more students are graduating from college than ever before. And we're also pursuing an aggressive strategy to promote innovation that reins in tuition costs. We've got to lower costs so that young people are not burdened by enormous debt when they make the right decision to get higher education. And next week, Michelle and I will bring together college presidents and nonprofits to lead a campaign to help more low-income students attend and succeed in college. But while higher education may be the surest path to the middle class, it's not the only one. So we should offer our people the best technical education in the world. That's why we've worked to connect local businesses with community colleges so that workers, young and old, can earn the new skills that earn them more money. And I've also embraced an idea that I know all of you at the Center for American Progress have championed. And by the way, Republican governors in a couple of states have championed. And that's making high-quality preschool available to every child in America. We know that kids in these programs grow up likelier to get more education, earn higher wages, form more stable families of their own. It starts a virtuous cycle, not a vicious one. And we should invest in that. We should give all of our children that chance. And as we empower our young people for future success, the third part of this middle-class economics is empowering our workers. It's time to ensure our collective bargaining laws function as they're supposed to, so unions have a level playing field to organize for a better deal for workers and better wages for the middle class. It's time to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act so that women will have more tools to fight pay discrimination. It's time to pass the Employment Non-Discrimination Act so workers can't be fired for who they are or who they love. And even though we're bringing manufacturing jobs back to America, we're creating more good-paying jobs in education and healthcare and business services, we know that we're going to have a greater and greater portion of our people in the service sector. And we know that there are airport workers and fast food workers and nurse assistants and retail salespeople who work their tails off and are still living at or barely above poverty. And that's why it's well past the time to raise a minimum wage that in real terms right now is below where it was when Harry Truman was in office. This shouldn't be an ideological question. You know, it was Adam Smith, the father of free market economics, who once said They who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. And for those of you who don't speak Old English, let me translate. It means if you work hard, you should make a decent living. If you work hard, you should be able to support a family. Now, we all know the arguments that have been used against a higher minimum wage. Some say it actually hurts low-wage workers. Business will be less likely to hire them. But there's no solid evidence that a higher minimum wage costs jobs, and research shows it raises incomes for low-wage workers and boosts short-term economic growth. Others argue that if we raise the minimum wage, companies will just pass those costs on to consumers. But a growing chorus of businesses, small and large, argue differently. You know, already there are extraordinary companies in America that provide decent wages, salaries and benefits, and training for their workers, and deliver a great product to consumers. Now, SAS in North Carolina offers child care and sick leave. REI, a company my Secretary of Interior used to run, offers retirement plans and strives to cultivate a good work balance. There are companies out there that do right by their workers. They recognize that paying a decent wage actually helps their bottom line, reduces turnover, means workers have more money to spend, to save, maybe eventually start a business of their own. A broad majority of Americans agree we should raise the minimum wage. That's why last month voters in New Jersey decided to become the 20th state to raise theirs even higher. That's why yesterday the D.C. Council voted to do it too. I agree with those voters. I agree with those voters, and I'm going to keep pushing until we get a higher minimum wage for hard-working Americans across the entire country. It will be good for our economy. It will be good for our families. Number 4, as I alluded to earlier, we still need targeted programs for the communities and workers that have been hit hardest by economic change and the Great Recession. These communities are no longer limited to the inner city. They're found in neighborhoods hammered by the housing crisis, manufacturing towns hit hard by years of plants packing up, landlocked rural areas where young folks oftentimes feel like they've got to leave just to find a job. There are communities that just aren't generating enough jobs anymore. So we put forward new plans to help these communities and their residents. Because we've watched cities like Pittsburgh or my hometown of Chicago revamp themselves. And if we give more cities the tools to do it, not handouts, but a hand up, cities like Detroit can do it too. So in a few weeks, we'll announce the first of these promise zones, urban and rural communities where we're going to support local efforts focused on a national goal, and that is a child's course in life should not be determined by the zip code he's born in, but by the strength of his work ethic and the scope of his dreams. And we're also going to do more for the long-term unemployed. You know, for people who've been out of work for more than 6 months, often through no fault of their own, life is a catch-22. Companies won't give their resume an honest look because they've been laid off so long. But they've been laid off so long because companies won't give their resume an honest look. And that's why earlier this year I challenged CEOs from some of America's best companies to give these Americans a fair shot. And next month, many of them will join us at the White House for an announcement about this. Fifth, we've got to revamp retirement to protect Americans in their golden years, to make sure another housing collapse doesn't steal the savings in their homes. We've also got to strengthen our safety net for a new age, so it doesn't just protect people who hit a run of bad luck from falling into poverty, but also propels them back out of poverty. Today, nearly half of full-time workers and 80% of part-time workers don't have a pension or retirement account at their job. About half of all households don't have any retirement savings. So we're going to have to do more to encourage private savings and shore up the promise of Social Security for future generations. And remember, these are promises we make to one another. We don't do it to replace the free market, but we do it to reduce risk in our society by giving people the ability to take a chance and catch them if they fall. One study shows that more than half of Americans will experience poverty at some point during their adult lives. Think about that. This is not an isolated situation. More than half of Americans at some point in their lives will experience poverty. That's why we have nutrition assistance, or the program known as SNAP, because it makes a difference for a mother who's working, but is just having a hard time putting food on the table for her kids. That's why we have unemployment insurance, because it makes a difference for a father who lost his job and is out there looking for a new one, that he can keep a roof over his kids' heads. By the way, Christmas time is no time for Congress to tell more than 1 million of these Americans that they have lost their unemployment insurance, which is what will happen if Congress does not act before they leave on their holiday vacation. The point is, these programs are not typically hammocks for people to just lie back and relax. These programs are almost always temporary means for hard-working people to stay afloat while they try to find a new job or going to school to retrain themselves for the jobs that are out there, or sometimes just to cope with a bout of bad luck. Now, progressives should be open to reforms that actually strengthen these programs and make them more responsive to a 21st century economy. For example, we should be willing to look at fresh ideas to revamp unemployment and disability programs, to encourage faster and higher rates of reemployment without cutting benefits. We shouldn't weaken fundamental protections built over generations, because given the constant churn in today's economy and the disabilities that many of our friends and neighbors live with, they're needed more than ever. We should strengthen them and adapt them to new circumstances so they work even better. But understand that these programs of social insurance benefit all of us, because we don't know when we might have a run of bad luck. We don't know when we might lose a job. Of course, for decades, there was one yawning gap in the safety net that did more than anything else to expose working families to the insecurities of today's economy, namely our broken health care system. That's why we fought for the Affordable Care Act, because 14,000 Americans lost their health insurance every single day. And even more died each year because they didn't have health insurance at all. We did it because millions of families who thought they had coverage were driven into bankruptcy by out-of-pocket costs that they didn't realize would be there. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens couldn't get any coverage at all. And Dr. King once said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health care is the most shocking and inhumane. Well, not anymore. Because in the 3 years since we passed this law, the share of Americans with insurance is up. The growth of health care costs are down to the slowest rate in 50 years. More people have insurance, and more have new benefits and protections. 100 million Americans who've gained the right for free preventive care like mammograms and contraception. The more than 7 million Americans who've saved an average of $1,200 on their prescription medicine. Every American who won't go broke when they get sick because their insurance can't limit their care anymore. More people without insurance have gained insurance, more than 3 million young Americans who've been able to stay on their parents' plan. The more than 500,000 Americans and counting who are poised to get coverage starting on January 1st, some for the very first time. And it is these numbers, not the ones in any poll, that will ultimately determine the fate of this law. It's the measurable outcomes and reduced bankruptcies and reduced hours that have been lost because somebody couldn't make it to work, and healthier kids with better performance in schools, and young entrepreneurs who have the freedom to go out there and try a new idea. Those are the things that will ultimately reduce a major source of inequality and help ensure more Americans get the start that they need to succeed in the future. I've acknowledged more than once that we didn't roll out parts of this law as well as we should have, but the law's already working in major ways that benefit millions of Americans right now, even as we've begun to slow the rise in health care costs, which is good for family budgets, good for federal and state budgets, and good for the budgets of businesses, small and large. So this law is going to work, and for the sake of our economic security, it needs to work. And as people in states as different as California and Kentucky sign up every single day for health insurance, signing up in droves, they're proving they want that economic security. You know, if the Senate Republican leader still thinks he's going to be able to repeal this someday, he might want to check with the more than 60,000 people in his home state who are already set to finally have coverage that frees them from the fear of financial ruin and lets them afford to take their kids to see a doctor.
C-SPAN networks and in the video library at cspan.org. Back live to the House floor. A previous question here ahead of the vote on the rule for two bills, one dealing with changes to patent litigation, another would exempt most private equity firms from having to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Democrats in this previous question vote seeking to prevent the House from adjourning until the House has adopted a conference report on the budget resolution. Still some votes to go. Underway at this hour at the Pentagon, a briefing with the Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Martin Dempsey. It's live on C-SPAN 2, but we're going to take you over there as this vote continues.
The staff phases out the SES-led task force on business and stability operations and realigns the portfolios of the 5 Assistant Secretaries of Defense for Policy. The plan also eliminates 4 Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense positions and their corresponding support structures through a consolidation and realignment of the policy staff overhaul structure. Second, we will strengthen the Deputy Chief Management Officer, the DCMO position, by realigning the Office of the Director of Administration and Management and its components under the DCMO structure. Secretary Donnelly's review found that since its inception, the DCMO has lacked the resources and the mandate to effectively fulfill its role as a DoD-wide manager. Meanwhile, the DAM and others have important organizational management planning and oversight functions across the department and the National Capital Region that will further enable the DCMO's work. The consolidation of these offices into a true DoD-wide management office will provide for better coordination and integration of DoD's business affairs, including performance management and compliance, and result in a much stronger and more empowered Deputy Chief Management Officer. Third, as the DCMO organization becomes the focal point for DoD-wide management, administration, and business oversight, it's my intent to transfer specific responsibility for business IT systems from the DCMO to DoD's Chief Information Officer. I will work with Congress to make this change because it will strengthen DoD's ability to address growing IT and cyber challenges. The Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics will continue to be responsible for acquisitions of IT systems. Fourth, in order to consolidate intelligence oversight and privacy compliance functions, I am directing that the Office of the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Intelligence Oversight and the Defense Privacy and Civil Liberties Offices be combined into a single office that will be aligned under the new DCMO organization. Fifth, as part of our overall streamlining efforts, the Office of Net Assessment, ONA, will report to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. We will preserve ONA as a distinct organization with direct links to the Secretary of Defense, but this change will better ensure that its long-range comparative analysis inform and influence DoD's overall strategy and policy. Sixth, I'm directing that the Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness rebalance resources across her office's 3 Assistant Secretaries of Defense in order to sharpen PNR's focus on force management, force readiness, and military health care and military compensation and retirement reform. Seventh, I'm directing the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence to move forward with planning for how its mission and focus should evolve after the drawdown of the post-9/11 conflicts, including staffing levels, organizations, and programs. Eighth, I've also approved plans for eliminating the 5 remaining Deputy Undersecretaries of Defense who are not presidentially appointed or Senate confirmed, fulfilling direction from the Congress. To further improve the management and administration of OSD, I am directing additional longer-term follow-up actions to include refining OSD budget categories, improving oversight of contractor support, completing a review of OSD's workload, and directing a biennial review of OSD to establish a regular assessment of the office's requirements. Once fully implemented, these actions will provide for improved and sustained oversight of OSD structure and resources. All these decisions will not only result in a smaller and flatter OSD, but one that I believe will be better prepared for the serious and complex 21st century security challenges that we face as a department and as a nation. In this constrained budget environment, we will continue to look for ways to reduce overhead, improve efficiency, and maximize combat power. But we must do so in a deliberate manner after careful consideration of how best to ensure this department is able to carry out its mission of defending the nation. Most of the reductions in OSD staff that I've announced today will occur through a process of natural attrition in order to minimize the impact on our workforce. If the department is forced to take the steep sequestration cuts on the order of $500 billion
This question is ordered. Question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Colorado. Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having voted, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic devices. It's a 5-minute vote.
And now on to the vote on the rule for 2 pieces of legislation. One would modify the patent infringement litigation process to discourage the abuse of the system by those patent holders who seek to profit by filing lawsuits in an effort to force defendants into a quick legal settlement. If the rule passes, they will consider that bill tomorrow. The other bill under the rule would roll back some of the registration and reporting requirements on private equity fund investment advisors that are in the Dodd-Frank financial regulations. This is a 5-minute vote, and we expect once if the rule is passed that they will again take up general debate on the private equity bill.
resolution is adopted. Without objection, motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Are they ready? Well, clear the aisles. The House will be in order. Would members please take their conversations from the floor, clear the well, clear the aisles. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 429, I call up H.R. 1105, the Small Business Capital Access and Job Preservation Act, and ask for its immediate consideration by the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 197, H.R. 1105, a bill to amend the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 to provide for registration exemption for private equity fund advisors and for other purposes.
Once again, members are asked to remove their conversations from the floor of the House chamber, to clear the aisles so that the House may be in order. Pursuant to House Resolution 429, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 11329 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered read. After 1 hour of debate on the bill as amended, it shall be in order to consider the further amendment printed in Part B of House Report 113-283, if offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, or her designee, which shall be considered read and shall be separately debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henseling, and the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 30 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous material for the record on H.R. 1105, currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize myself for as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, since Congress was not in session last week, perhaps some of my colleagues missed the front page headline from the Washington Post. I read, quote, "Among American workers, poll finds unprecedented anxiety about jobs and economy." According to the report, American workers are living with unprecedented economic anxiety. More than 6 in 10 worry that they will lose their jobs. Nearly 1 in 3 say they worry a lot about losing their jobs. The article goes on to mention an American named John Stewart. Wakes up every morning at 1:30 a.m. for a 2-hour commute to catch 2 different buses in Philadelphia so he can get to work on time. In the newspaper, he said, quote, "I can't save money to buy the things I need to live as a human being." But, Mr. Speaker, we don't have to read the Washington Post. All we have to do is listen to our own constituents, since even today, millions of our fellow countrymen remain unemployed and underemployed. I hear these stories every week myself. Recently, I heard from Ida in Wills Point, Texas, in the 5th Congressional District that I represent. She and her husband own her 79-year-old husband own a small trucking company. But she wrote me that, quote, "Because of increasing regulations and taxes in the past 4 years, we've lost all but 2 of our trucks." She goes on to write me, "My husband is the only driver right now because I can no longer drive. He drives full-time, 3,500 miles a week most weeks, because we can't live on his Social Security." She says, quote, "We are really stuck in a hole." Millions, Mr. Speaker, are stuck in a hole. Today we have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to do something to help raise many of our fellow countrymen out of that hole of economic anxiety and economic hardship. Today we have the opportunity to pass H.R. 1105, the Small Business Capital Access and Jobs Preservation Act. I want to commend the bipartisan group of members, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, who introduced the bill. Mr. Hurt of Virginia, Mr. Himes of Connecticut, Mr. Garrett of New Jersey, and Mr. Cooper of Tennessee. As chairman of the Financial Services Committee, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all the members of the committee who came together across party lines to approve the bill. Mr. Speaker, nearly 1/3 of the Democrats who sit on our committee joined with 30 Republicans in supporting H.R. 1105. In short, Mr. Speaker, this is indeed a bipartisan jobs bill. We know that small businesses face an incredible red tape burden. And in fact, a recent survey of the National Federation of Independent Business said that, quote, "Government regulations and red tape are the single most important challenge that small businesses face in creating and preserving jobs." Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I heard from another small business person in Grand Saline, Texas, in my district. He said, because of overregulation, quote, "Our business has devolved from one that provides a service for a customer into one that provides that same service as an afterthought while our real efforts go into paperwork." Now, Mr. Speaker, we can debate the relative merits or demerits of the Dodd-Frank Act, but even the primary author himself, former Chairman Frank, admitted that perhaps not every aspect of Dodd-Frank achieved perfection. And many of us would argue on a bipartisan basis that that part of the Act that requires small business investors who are private equity advisors to register with the SEC is perhaps one of those provisions that is in need of reform. This is a provision, Mr. Speaker, that many of us believe was aimed at Wall Street but ends up hurting Main Street. Because of this provision embedded in Dodd-Frank, smaller firms that invest in entrepreneurs and in small businesses face yet one more significant regulatory cost, regulatory burden, more red tape. As one of the small business investors testified before our committee, It's going to cost his company $200,000 every year to comply with the regulation. Mr. Speaker, he went on to say, quote, while for some larger firms this is an insignificant cost, for medium-sized firms such as ours that offers capital to small businesses, it is a significant expense. And pay attention to this, Mr. Speaker. He said, quote, this money comes directly out of our funds intended for investment into Main Street. In today's economy, to help pull these people out of this hole of economic anxiety, we need more private sector, more private equity investment into Main Street. Private equity equals small business jobs. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, between 1995 and 2010, 23,000 different companies across our nation benefited from private equity investment, employing 3 million different people. And the investments that are made by private equity historically have grown jobs at 3 times the rate of other companies. And so what does this look like? I got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, it looks like an outfit called New Mountain Capital that invested in a company named Inmar, a national coupon and reverse logistics processing company. By helping them update their IT with a $100 million investment, they now sport 4,200 different employees. The face of private equity looks like Capital South Partners that invested in a North Carolina firm, Vita Non-Wovens, and now they have 95 employees in High Point, North Carolina, and I should add, parenthetically, another 55 employees in my native Texas. This is the face of private equity. These are some of the small business jobs that are getting created. Now, we may hear from some that this is needed to somehow battle Wall Street, but let me tell you what private equity is not. Private equity is not Wall Street. It's not complex derivative trading. It's not currency swaps, Mr. Speaker. It is not about systemic risk. That is not what this is about. And so, again, this was a provision aimed at Wall Street that unfortunately is hitting Main Street. It is time to make sure that Americans like John in Philadelphia can live like a human being. It's time to make sure that constituents like mine, Ida and her husband, don't have to drive 3,500 miles a week just so they can put food on the table. Mr. Speaker, it's time, again, for this institution to put jobs first, not regulators first, but jobs first. And I urge all of my colleagues to adopt H.R. 1105. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Massachusetts manage the time at this time.
Without objection. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I thank her for her leadership on this issue. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1105. I yield myself as time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1105, which will create a gaping loophole for private equity fund advisors and deprive investors and regulators of important information about the risk that these funds pose. The Dodd-Frank Act wisely required that advisors to all hedge funds, private equity funds, and other private funds register and file regular reports with the SEC. It did this for 2 reasons. 1, to help regulators better understand the systemic risks that these funds pose to the overall financial system, and to provide investors in these funds with meaningful information about the fund's governance. This bill would exempt nearly every private equity fund advisor from these important disclosure requirements. Some of my colleagues who support this bill will argue that because private equity funds were not the cause of the last crisis, we should not subject them to these modest transparency and accountability requirements. But one of the most important lessons that we did learn during the financial crisis is that systemic threats seem to always bubble up from the opaque and unregulated sectors of the market. Giving this exemption will allow threats to once again grow in the dark corners of our financial system, only showing themselves when it is too late to prevent serious harm to the American taxpayer. Supporters of this bill, while well-intended, will also point to the provisions that ensures advisors to private equity funds with leverage ratios over 2-to-1 will still have to register. Now, this may sound attractive on its surface until you realize that every private equity fund is basically within that parameter. Private equity funds invest in companies, and it is these portfolio companies that load up on leverage and that have the potential to take on outside risks, piling on the leverage while the private equity fund itself appears on its surface to be modestly leveraged. A private equity fund could have a leverage ratio well below 2-to-1, while its portfolio companies are leveraged in excess of 30-to-1, masking the actual risk that these funds pose. Nearly every private equity fund in existence today would come in below the 2-to-1 leverage cap. This is a hollow limitation that provides no protection to the fund's investors or to the American taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, we learned the hard way after the recent financial crisis that systemic risks grow in the dark corners of our financial markets, and that the more information that we can gather about how the markets work, the safer we will be. The registration and reporting requirements for private equity advisors are modest and narrowly tailored, but they provide investors and regulators with important information. Rolling back these reforms now moves us in the wrong direction. I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 1105, and I reserve the balance of our time.
Time is reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I am now privileged to yield 5 minutes to the primary author of this legislation, a real leader on our committee and in this Congress in creating jobs. Yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1105, the Small Business Capital Access and Job Preservation Act, a bipartisan bill that our colleagues, Representative Cooper, Himes, and Garrett, and I introduced earlier this year. I thank all of them for their leadership on this issue. I'd also like to thank Chairman Hensarling and, again, Chairman Garrett for their support and leadership on this bill as we were able to achieve a bipartisan vote out of the Financial Services Committee. Every member of this body can agree that with millions of Americans out of work, our top focus in Congress should be, and it must be, enacting policies to help spur job creation throughout our nation. Today, the House takes up another bill to encourage economic growth and job creation by increasing the flow of private capital to small businesses that are found on main streets all across America. At a time when the available avenues of capital and credit for small businesses continue to decrease, capital investments from private equity into our communities are more important than ever. Unfortunately, Dodd-Frank has placed a costly and unnecessary regulatory burden of SEC registration on advisors to private equity, while, by the way, exempting advisors to similar investment funds. These registration requirements do not improve the stability of our financial system, and they restrict the ability of private equity to invest capital in our small businesses to spur job growth. In Virginia's 5th District, my district, there are literally thousands of jobs that exist because of the investment of private equity. These critical investments allow our small businesses to innovate, expand their operations, and create the jobs that our communities need. If enacted, the unnecessary burdens on advisors to private equity funds that do not have excessive leverage would be eliminated, and they would be given the same exemption from the SEC's registration requirements that venture capital advisors enjoy. These registration requirements, which do not make the financial system any more stable, impose an undue burden on small and mid-sized private equity firms and decrease the ability of their investment to create jobs. During our Financial Services Committee hearing on the bill, witnesses discussed the costs these requirements have imposed on private equity firms. They force investment advisors to private equity to expend substantial resources that disproportionately affect small and mid-sized funds, with costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars annually or more to comply with these requirements. It is important to note that most people, including the SEC Chair, Mary Jo White, concede that private equity funds did not cause the 2008 financial crisis and are not a source of systemic risk, despite that argument being the impetus for the registration requirement under Dodd-Frank. These funds are not highly interconnected with other financial market participants, and therefore the failure of a private equity fund would be highly unlikely to trigger cascading losses that would lead to a similar financial crisis. Additionally, these funds invest primarily in illiquid assets, including small Main Street businesses found across our country. These businesses are diversified across multiple industries and therefore lack concentrated exposure to any single sector. Furthermore, investors in private equity firms are all sophisticated investors who negotiate for the strongest investor protections. These sophisticated investors include public pension funds, university endowments, nonprofit foundations, many of whom are the primary beneficiaries of private equity successes. Those investors typically are represented by counsel and heavily negotiate fund terms in advance of investing, including reporting governance and conflicts of interest. It should also be noted that H.R. 1105 does nothing to change the current federal law with respect to common law and statutory fiduciary protections owed by investors to advisors to private equity funds. These are already existing significant investor protections available both contractually and in the form of state and federal law, and anti-fraud protections, investor protections that exist whether or not the advisors are registered with the SEC. In the end, the costs of unnecessary registration represent real capital that otherwise could be used to invest in companies such as Virginia Candle in our district, a company that through private equity investment expanded from a garage in Lynchburg, Virginia to millions of homes across the world. Beyond Virginia Candle in Virginia, private equity-backed companies employ over 7.5 million people. Let me say that again. Private equity backed companies employ over 7.5 million people nationwide in over 17,000 U.S. companies. The impact of the registration requirements stand to diminish job creation in each of the congressional districts represented on this floor today. I ask all my colleagues today to join me in voting yes on H.R. 1105 and pass this bill from the House in order to increase the flow of private capital to our small businesses so that they can innovate, grow, create jobs for the American people. Mr. Speaker, I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman. I give myself just 1 minute. I do want to respond to the gentleman's invoking of the SEC Chair, Mary Jo White. Judging from the gentleman's remarks, you would think that she might be in favor of this bill. But let me talk about what she says about this bill in particular. This is a quote. Our markets would not be well served by narrowing the scope of the Commission's jurisdiction and oversight of these advisors with respect to this bill. She also said that private equity investors are in need of the same protection as other private fund investors. And lastly, she has also said the Commission has brought enforcement actions. They're talking about the advisability of having oversight over advisors and having these disclosures made. The quote is that the Commission has brought enforcement actions against private equity funds and their advisory personnel involving unlawful pay-to-play schemes, insider trading, conflicts of interest, valuation, and misappropriation of assets. Now, if you think about the argument that pension funds may not, I'll give myself another 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
When you think about the protections that are necessary for pension funds, especially where these workers have invested whole lives in these pension funds, you understand the need for this disclosure. At this time, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, an active member of the committee.
Recognized for 3 minutes.
Yeah, let me thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Mr. Speaker, before I launch into the substantive critique of this bill, and I urge members to vote no, I'd like to make a preliminary observation, and that is that when our chairman of our committee begins his presentation making a broad-based critique and attack on regulation, members should be very careful about this, because good regulation is good for American people. We need health, safety protections. We need to be protected from unsafe water, unsafe products, and investors need to be protected as well. And so when any time a member of Congress or anyone comes up and says, well, regulations are bad, this is obviously wrong, and the American people know it. And therefore, when you're being told to do something just because regulations are always bad, you should be very suspicious of what's going on and dig deeper into the situation. I urge members to just consider how important good, solid, well-tailored regulation is to benefit the American people, and I push back on anybody who just makes a frontal assault on all regulation, no matter how good or how bad or just regulation in general. And this has been a theme, you know, from around here, and I urge members to be suspicious of it. Now, this bill also should be considered that when this bill is in front of us, we should know that people who have looked carefully at it, members who are wondering what they want to do on this bill, should consider that the Obama administration has strongly opposed this bill, and with senior advisors recommending a veto. So this is a bill that's not going to become law anyway. There is no Senate companion. I just checked, been advised that there's not a Senate companion. So we're really here talking about a bill that is going to be threatened veto by the president and has no Senate companion, but is also opposed by SEC Chair Mary Jo White and Council for Institutional Investors, an organization which has investors' interests in mind, as this bill is trying to make investor information more opaque, and Americans for Financial Reform, not to mention Consumer Federation of America and AFL-CIO and state securities regulators. So the people who work with these regulations all the time don't think they're the right thing to do, and even if some members might consider that, well, maybe this might get capital to somebody who wouldn't otherwise get it, the people who regulate and use these regulations every day have carefully considered H.R. 1101 and have come to the conclusion, 1105, that it is bad for investors, that it creates less transparency, not more, and therefore is, in fact, a risk to our financial well-being. So Americans are looking for, obviously, jobs. This is the big hook. People put the jobs. One more minute? Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yield the gentleman additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
As the way to get anybody to vote for anything around here says it's going to create jobs. Of course, there's been no demonstration of how this is going to create jobs. But the point is that it